Hello everyone, this is Dr. Vick. I'm here with my first video. Please bear with me. I'm trying out some new software and hardware, but we'll get the hang of it. So this video is an introduction to my thoughts on economics. I introduce some key terms and identify two different approaches, economic approaches that we'll take in this class. So looking over here at my blackboard, I have three lines with three levels. The way I look at economics is we're going to look at this bottom level first. And at this bottom level, what's going on is basically the level that we're going to look at in an economic approach. The level that we start looking at is the level of the individual. Okay, we want to look at individuals here. And what do I mean by looking at individuals? Well, we're going to model individual behavior in order to understand some of their decision making. So behavior and decisions. And, we're usually interested in economic decisions, buying things, working, running a business. But what we do as economists is we put these models together with some reasonable assumptions, some reasonable descriptions of how most people act. So what go into our behaviors and decisions? Well, one thing is our goals. So goals are part of our focus in economics and models. What I mean by goals, as a head of household with kids, a goal of mine is to make sure that they are eating well, that they're getting enough to eat. If I'm going into business, one of my goals is to be sustainable and make profit. These are reasonable assumptions that describe lots of people. So we have goals. That's one of the first ones we look at. We also have constraints. Even though we want to feed our kids, we only have so much money in the wallet. Even though we want to make money in our business, there's a constraint on what people want, constraint on what we can do, what I know how to do. So those are two of the main ones. Other things that we focus on, and when we're looking at our behaviors, not just how we behave, but we're also looking at some of our interactions with other people. So this becomes a key part of focus. We look at some key terms that you've probably heard of in economics, is that we respond to incentives. And different incentives may change either our goals or our constraints and affect our behavior. Along with incentives, when we make one decision and we devote time and resources to one thing, we've lost the opportunity to do something else, which is a cost. And that's in economics, that's what we call opportunity costs. So that's the level of the individual. In this class, we'll make models, mathematical and graphical models that describe these individual behaviors. Now what we do is, what's interesting in economics, and this is something that was thought about for a long time, including some ideas of Adam Smith, but when we have individuals interacting, following their goals, being constrained by things, making decisions based on incentives, you get this interesting phenomenon where you have lots of people interacting. And you have this higher order phenomenon that occurs based on the individuals, but it's different from it. And this is an idea that a higher order collection of information, of behaviors, is not just individual in itself. It kind of takes its own form. This is the idea of emergence. So all these individuals interacting, what you get from that is the emergence of a new level. And what is this new level that emerges out of individual behavior? Well, the new level is that of markets. Okay? So markets emerge out of this individual behavior. And what do I mean by markets? Well, we'll talk a lot more about it, but this is where we get into looking at supply and demand. So demand emerges from the interactions and behavior of lots of individual consumers. Supply emerges from the behavior and interactions of many producers. And this idea of emergence is recently become used across a variety of disciplines, including neuroscience, computer science, urban development, and economics. And it's basically this idea that these higher form concepts, these higher forms of analysis, these higher levels of analysis, they are made up of much smaller parts, but they're different than just the sum of those parts. An example from biology, examples from biology include looking at bees and beehives, or ants and anthills. And the functioning of the anthill is not just the summation of the individual ants. Individual ants are very simplistic in their goals and their constraints, but anthills are much more complex. Same goes with individual behavior in economies. We can't directly predict what's going on in the market based on individual behaviors, but some of these concepts, such as markets, evolve from that. Emerge from that. This is the idea that Adam Smith knew a while back. He called it the invisible hand. Friedrich von Hayek has talked about this. It is a very micro individual focus, but we see that these really interesting complexities emerge from that individual behavior. So that's the second level. The third level is, by the way, I should say, levels 1 and 2, these are the realms of microeconomics. Okay, so that'll be the focus in this class, is looking at individuals and looking at how markets emerge from them, and then studying at the market level itself. So the market level, again, it's going to be individual markets, such as the market for apples, the market for fast food workers, the market for housing. Now, if you go further in economics, you go from studying all these individual markets, and they become economies, right? The entire economy is based on a bunch of these individual markets, and you want to look at industries, across different industries, and come to more macro level stuff. So number 3 here, studying the whole economy, is the work of macro. Okay, so it's moving up from individual markets into a higher level form. So studying country economies or large scale economies. Now, one approach to economics looks at really just the individual aspects that deal with market behavior, and then look at how markets form economies. So we make individual mathematical and graphical models based on individual behavior as consumers and producers. We look at other mathematical models for supply and demand across different industries and markets. And then we look at mathematical models of economic behavior, and we make predictions. This mode of this approach to looking at the economic world is what we would call the neoclassical approach. I'll put two different approaches up here that I want to contrast, but this is the neoclassical one. And this is your textbook economics approaches, supply and demand, all these things. They are mathematical, they're used to predict. And so that's kind of the build up to this. Now I want to go back here because I want to focus on, going back from our basic principles of looking at what's going on at the individual level. That's not the entire story, is it? It's not just markets that emerge from individual behavior. Other things also emerge. So, for example, our individual behaviors with one another inform things like ethics. Ethics emerges in different ways from individual behavior. Also, law. We come up with ways to govern the way we act. Enforcement. Rules of enforcement and policing and protection of property arise. Overall government, politics. More broadly, things like culture. Culture is made up of people interacting in a similar way that the market emerges. Culture. Religion. So individuals working together or against each other lead to not just markets, but overall institutions. So that's why I left this blank over here. I don't want to make this just number 2 is not just the level of markets, it's overall the level of institutions. Okay? The level of institutions, one of these types of institutions are markets and the way our economy runs. But there's other institutions going on as well. And now what's interesting is it isn't just that all these institutions emerge from individual behaviors. To make this even more complex, some of these other institutions actually have effects on us, of course, right? So if there's a law in place that keeps me from being able to sell something and produce something, then that law, that institutional level law, is actually affecting constraints on my economic behavior. So many of these affect our constraints. If culture is in wanting me or pushing me towards one type of work, it's having an effect on my goals. It's either expanding my goals or maybe it's constraining them because I stop looking at other things. So not only do you have one flow of this emergence coming from individual people, but once institutions are established, they can lead to changes at our individual level, making the study of all this stuff much more complex. Culture, religion, if you live in a culture where in a policy environment where discrimination has been tolerated, well, that has direct effects on the constraints that people who are being discriminated against has constraints on their economic opportunities, their goals, their interactions, incentives, and opportunity costs. So we take these things all together to do a much more complicated view. This ceases to be just a mathematical exercise as in the neoclassical approach. Instead, we take a second approach where we are considering all sorts of institutions, and this is called an institutional. Institutional approach to economics. Okay? So that summarizes this first video. We will be using both the neoclassical and institutional approaches in this class, and I'll see you next time.